When in the Water. Written by Daniel Burnett. Narrated by Daniel Burnett. He awoke to gentle bobbing, moved only by the force of his breathing, to find himself adorned by a life ring whilst the stillest of waters cuddled him. How the hell did he get here? Where had he been? Where was he going? He created waves in the water by searching his circumference frantically, followed by a self-examination to look for any injuries. There were none. His Cartesian circle had found him no shore to reach for. He was stranded in the middle of the calmest of oceans, with only his orange and white polyethylene hero for company. Fear set in pretty quickly, truth be told. Fear of a fin, fear of a brush against the leg, fear of a giant plug being pulled. But as always, it was fear of the unknown that troubled this timid human most of all. He could feel his feet touching nothing beneath him, filling him with a sickening validation that the unknown was more of a threat than anything else that could inhabit his new temporary home.
Were I, honestly, straddled upon ship or boat?
He interrogated himself, like a floating question mark.
Straddled, like the foolish ugly duckling, perched upon a rock fancying itself mermaids, when mermania befit the collective mind but mine.
He had not given any other scenario but his own foolishness thought as to explain his newfound predicament. He must have placed himself here in a wild, drunken stupor, and that was his only theory thus far. He looked toward the sky for signs of life, but not a bird nor a cloud flew past. Finding nothing, he turned his focus from the blue of the sky back to the blue of the ocean, the void, the depths. He moved his hands around under the water as if to look for a rope that led all the way to a shoreline. No such lucky entanglement had befallen his hands.
My hands!
He gasped.
Should they not be sunken and pruned, withered and emaciated, lest the water be new or kind?
He was both relieved and befuddled by this revelation. He could not have been in the water for long. Was there some residual clue lurking in the water that could entice this truth that he felt so entitled to? No sooner than thinking it, a light, slightly scraping, hollow bump against his elbow occurred. He turned, startled by the potential predator, only to find no predator at all. Instead, his eyes fell upon something a little more puzzling. It was a mask, floating face up, string down, in the water. Coloured orange and white, like his life ring, and an apparently content smile etched into its plastic face. It felt like a clue, all right. It felt like mockery.
Could somebody have done this to me?
He whispered. The very thought that someone could have put him there sent shivers through his skin.
Maybe they drugged me. No blow to the head. I checked over that.
He had made a few minor enemies in his time. He was more of a persistent irritation to people, as opposed to an infuriating soul. He was once described by his own mother as the itch you'd prefer only slightly over pain, so not his greatest reference. His mother was odd herself, dabbling in the occult, and often pointed at by the neighbours. She still viewed her son's behaviour as far more odd than her own. Our protagonist had been described as overly dramatic more than once, I'm afraid. His name was Franco. That is what he would want me to tell you, the reader of his story. His real name was Francis, and though you'd be led in thought to Sir Francis Drake, Franco led himself every time to his auntie Frances, whom he was convinced was his namesake. Franco was studying the arts, but could never elaborate on which art he was learning. He made money by writing poetry for hapless men to woo their fair ladies, so he was pretty strapped for cash. Franco swam under the buoyancy of the life ring and remained attached to it with one hand. The polyethylene ring had started to press into his back, and he was aggrieved by this design flaw. So now, using the ring as an armband, he laid on his back and floated there, thinking, motionless, as still as the water surrounding him. The mask now placed on his face protect it from the sun. He must have stayed motionless for all of 5 minutes. Quite a record for Franco. Waking him from his rest was a low rumble. The mask immediately fell off as he bolted forward at the sound waves. It sounded like it was coming from the sky, but felt as though it were from beneath him. Franco could feel his heart begin to race, appropriately in line with the raising volume of the rumble. Almost whiplashing himself, he span, trying to see a cause for this now deafening earthquake of noise. The sound then suddenly came to a halt. There was a momentary silence. About 20 or so meters away, the water appeared to have steam rising from it for a couple of seconds. The water then jolted upward violently, creating a giant wall of splash looming over Franco before crashing down on top of him, as though a hyperactive child had jumped into a puddle. Franco gripped onto the life ring and luckily resurfaced. The water was completely still again, as though the only thing causing a splash was Franco's dramatic reactions to whatever was going on in his mind.
What is happening to me?
Genuinely shaken, Franco allowed a little whimper to fall through his trembling lips before catching it with his shaking hands. He might be dramatic, but he was determined to be brave too. In the distance he could see something gently moving towards him on the surface of the water. As it edged closer, it revealed itself. It was another mask, this time a blue one, with a look of fright scribbled across its expression. It was at this point that Franco decided the only way this could be the work of a man was if the man was him and he had gone mad. The other option was God. Readers, I should point out at this stage that I am not aware of God, or Franco's mind, or some other entity, being the creator of this new and interesting style of haunting, but I couldn't rule any of them out. But this was very much a haunting indeed, make no mistake. Designed by something who wanted people to figure out why they had been chosen to die. A tailor-made, existential crisis of the soul, trying desperately to answer the riddle posed by the demons that lurk within us all. Franco, using his arts training, decided that he should try to find his center and relax a little. Staying calm in a crisis is paramount, and he was starting to realize this now. He leaned back a little into the life ring, allowed his tired legs to float, and closed his eyes, breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth slowly. With each breath in, he thought, "Breathe in." And with each breath out, he recited, "Breathe out." As he breathed in, the mild smell of stale sulphur distracted him slightly, but he was able to return to his center. Breathe in, breathe out. It almost felt as though the tide was breathing with him, as he pictured himself being washed up gently on a sandy beach, greeted by rescue staff and lots of press to catch his story.
What hell abducts my hearing and replaces it with deafening death rattle? Aeolus screams through a disused esophagus, thundering me from peace.
Franco's rescue fantasy was abruptly ruined by a wet, rattling sound emanating from the water. It was very loud, very clear, and immediately obvious as to what it was. The bit that didn't make any sense, apart from the sound being there at all, of course, was the direction it was coming from. How could this nightmare noise sound so clear and yet come from under the water? Franco punched the water furiously. His merciless anger, coupled with his confused terror, rendered him mute after his outburst. He sat in silent, raging contemplation, ready to give a piece, if not all, of his mind to God, Satan, even Buddha, if need be. But they had not prevented this. The sky, in all its nothingness, had somehow, despite its lack of any features, turned flat. It was like a sheet of blue metal, which, without any actual indication of this, appeared to Franco at least to be very slowly descending upon him. So much so was he convinced of this, he even put his hands above him in a hope to stop the descent. His hands felt nothing land upon them. It was at this moment of embarrassment and humiliation, caused by his haunting, that he broke his short-lived silence.
Are you not there to protect us? Are you not paid in our blood? Are you not rewarded with our service? Answer me!
Franco was struck in the face so hard that his entire body looped over the back of the life ring. Immediately upon resurfacing, he was aware of his broken nose flooding the ocean with darkened red blood. It was another mask that had not only struck his face, but had embedded itself into his skin with the force in which it was flung. Franco screamed in pain at the plastic lacerations sewn from hairline all the way around to chin as the salty seawater crawled in. He tried to wrench the mask from his skin, but his fingers, covered in blood and water, just kept slipping against the plastic. He attempted to place his fingers underneath the side of the cheek, but the plastic was so sharp that it slit his fingers at the prints. At this point, the mask was now very nearly skin tight, and prizing it off would be a painful challenge. The mask had no mouth or nose holes, only eye holes, like the cheap ones that kids can decorate themselves for Halloween. The eye holes were apparently his only option, but space for bleeding fingers to go in and scoop the mask off there was not.
At the cost of my eyes, I will see you for what you are. A dull beast whose torture grows weary and lacks thrust through to the point of border.
Franco bellowed, his volume tailing off at the end of each sentence. Desperation and near breakdown had set in, but he kept fighting. His Aunt Frances would have been proud of such bravery from her nephew, had she seen the dramatic coward he had become in his later years. He felt around the eye holes another 3 or 4 circulations, trying to find some easier little sockets to pop his fingers into than the ones for his eyes. There was no better option. As the Franco bravado wore off and the timid and old Aunt Frances sneaked into view, considered leaving the mask on, but realised this was a ridiculous idea. Who would hear his cries for help should a ship be passing, and his lips are pressed against the inside of another face, barely able to make a mumble? With the reminder of help still being a possibility, Franco found new strength and began prepping himself mentally for the horror to come.
Only one is required. I need not damage both eyes, as once I have the mask in my clutches on one hooked finger, I merely need to pull to the side to free myself.
Whilst trying desperately to slow his breathing down to a more acceptable pace, he began his preparations. Against the closed yet twitching right eyelid, he placed the back of his left index finger, the flat of the fingernail just resting steadily in the outer corner of the eye socket. He first tried digging out the embedded plastic, very gingerly with the tip of his nail. He could get under it, which hurt like merry hell already, but could not get the purchase to pluck it out from the skin. It was as though it was burying itself deeper in, like a resistance movement. The only way to get enough purchase on it was to push the knuckle right into the socket, meaning his eyeball would need to be pushed backward. Franco knew not what would happen to an eyeball when pushed back into the skull, but in order to remove the mask, he would have to find out.
I will still have another. I will still have another.
Franco hollered a battle-like cry and went for it. The eyeball was pushed back by the knuckle with a rushed force, immediately changing the shape of the sphere, creating his own astigmatism to kick off the beginning of his eye problems. With the pressure being applied so energetically, the nerve fibres that leave the eye were pinched at the edge of the optic disc. His fingers hooked under the mask, and with a deafening, prolonged roar of pain, he ripped the mask from his skin. His eyeball didn't burst, thankfully, but his knuckle had created such pressure in the socket and had pushed the eye so far back that it was now rugby-balled, covered in burst blood vessels, and was indeed rendered somewhat useless. It was absolute agony. More so even than the bloody framing his face had obtained from the mask. Franco stopped his roaring and had turned to whimpering once more. He looked absolutely defeated. This mask was one of a deathly pale colour, moulded into the look of shock. Fitting, really, considering how shocked he was. So far, his injury count consisted of a broken nose, still bleeding but slowing, 3 deeply cut fingers, still bleeding, 1 deep cut around the circumference of his face, roughly 25 centimetres in length, still bleeding, 1 badly damaged eye, loss of vision, and minimal bleeding. Maybe clinical shock was what it was trying to tell him. It, whatever it was, would cause multiple injuries and bleed him out slowly. Did he have a choice in this? Was he triggering these strange happenings somehow? Were they random? Were they planned? Franco pondered over each scenario for so long he didn't seem to notice how much time had gone by, and how long it had been since his last assault. One thing he had noticed, though, was how his fingers still hadn't started to prune, and yet his hands and feet were starting to hurt. Cramps had started to slowly set in his calves, and he was certainly very hungry and very thirsty.
Land must be somewhere, he pondered.
Franco decided at that moment he would swim, holding onto the life ring and kicking his legs slowly. Swimming was one of 2 things that had crossed his mind, but had been ignored thus far. The other discarded thought was the possibility that he could be dreaming. It had dawned on him that this could be a dream, or that it could be a hallucination of some sort, but that was dashed as soon as he felt how real the pain was. He drifted for about 3 hours, grateful for at least having the life ring, as he knew damn well that without it, he would have drowned a lifetime ago.
What the hell put me here?
Was almost constantly in his mind, provided by constant reminders everywhere around him. There was a slither of thin rope attached to the life ring, which now held captive 3 masks.
Surely, if I persist, then land or person I will reach.
It was hard to tell if this was desperation or hope that Franco was clinging to so tightly. It's harder to tell if in this most unfortunate circumstance there was a difference between the two anyway. Daylight continued to beam down on Franco, despite him being sure that it should have been dark by now. No sooner had he thought this, the light turned from bright yellow to burnt orange. To Franco's surprise, he could think of a light setting, if you will, and it would happen almost instantly.
Aha! Got you by the testes, have I not?
For the first time in what felt like forever, Franco smiled with glee.
Upon a loophole I stumble, an aperture of control, of which I take the reins. The aquiline of the table tips towards me, offering a chance to break it instead of turn.
Franco thought of a shoreline to swim toward. Nothing. A ship to wave at. No such thing. A little bit less light? Bingo. Franco's smile diminished quickly, realizing it was just another trick, this time more cruel than a mask brushing his arm or even tearing into his face. This was a trick of control. The equivalent to a hell-bent dictator of a president finally getting to press the nuclear button just to find out it's a dimmer switch. He was enraged once more, but could not shout due to his drying throat and coarse vocal cords.
How can I get back at this thing?
Franco snapped the first mask in half. His nose stopped bleeding immediately and appeared to no longer be broken. It was as though he had completely undone the damage. Franco interpreted this as a retreat.
Aha!
He again exclaimed, this time far more smug.
This can be no trick. Fear, I sense, and not this time my own.
Franco grew in confidence. He had found a way to beat it.
You cower at the splitting of your precious mark. Revenge shall be sweet enough to reverse my bitter-tasting blood.
He grabbed the next mask, holding it first up to the sky, then down to the water, and tore it vertically from hairline to chin as he had the first. The death-rattling sound returned to the water as Franco's face and finger cuts stopped bleeding and started to heal as soon as the ripping was over. With nothing left to say, Franco picked up the last mask, ready to regain the sight in his right eye and put an end to this entire ordeal. He had conquered the thing that had so nearly conquered him. Bracing his arms, ready to tear the third mask in two, his attention was drawn to the face of the pale, still-bloodied mask. It now had a handwritten message on it. Sometimes, in order to stop our pain, we must look within ourselves for answers. Only when we look beneath our skin can change occur. Franco laughed out loud and dramatically shouted with all he had left.
It's your turn to feel pain now!
He gripped the top of the mask with both hands and held it out in front of him. The mask was smiling at him. With all the strength he could muster, Franco tore into the mask from the forehead to the chin in one quick, powerful motion. The sky filled with the sound of a woman's crying and the ocean jolted itself forward in grief. As soon as the two halves separated at the bottom of the mast, Franco felt an extreme tearing pain on his scalp. After this, he soon lost consciousness, as his head tore open from forehead to chin. Thick, black, red blood poured out as the two halves of his skull fainted sideways like blossoming cress leaves, followed by his bisected, troubled brain juices flopping out onto the life ring like a skin of a neglected custard. The two halves of the mask fell atop the surface of the water, out of Franco's lifeless, still pruneless hands. The halves waded through the brain stew and met at the scar which had separated them, rejoining seamlessly, allowing the words inside the mask to reconnect also.
To my dearest Franco, push these masks back out to sea. Just be you, and you be free. A monster lurks within us all. I sent you mine to make yours fall. Mother.
Hey, I'm Danny from Bedtime Stories UK, here at Timeless Studios, where we've just finished recording One in the Water. We really hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget to hit the like button, the subscribe button, and any other buttons you like, except Ian's buttons. They might have diseases.